But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by journalist Gareth Gore, who is the author of Opus, Dark Money, A Secretive Cult and Its Mission to Remake Our World. Thanks for joining us, Gareth.
Thanks to Andy and Cam for having me on. Greetings from London.
I guess just to begin with, Gareth, you're a financial journalist. How did you find yourself writing about this obscure Catholic sect?
That's quite a story in itself. I never set off to write a book about Opus Dei. In fact, I knew very little about Opus Dei when I started researching this book. This book basically started out as the story of a bank in Spain that just collapsed one day, literally collapsed overnight, one of the largest banks in Spain. And I, as a financial journalist, was sent to report on that story. But the more I dug into it, the less sense it all seemed to make. And then one day, this is kind of a journalist dream. One day I just kind of met some guy who told me the whole story about how this bank had been cash machine for this secretive Catholic organization for close to 60 years, how they'd siphoned hundreds of millions of dollars from this bank to finance its expansion right around the world to places like Australia, South America, Asia, across Europe. It's like I said, it's a journalist dream. It's just one of those crazy stories where the more you dig, the crazier it gets.
I enjoyed reading about you being in the archives of the bank and finding these forgotten files that someone had actually been sent to dispose of, but they'd missed these ones. Do you often find things that juicy in the archives of a bank?
This was my first experience of doing kind of real serious archival work. And yeah, so initially I went and I had a list of all the, various boxes, mountains and mountains of boxes, which had all been kind of carefully classified. And at this stage, I think that the kind of story you're thinking of is this. So one stage, I'd been in the archives for maybe 2 weeks, and I'd struck up a bit of rapport with the archivist. He was kind of really getting into this story as well and interested in the stuff that I was digging into. And one day he took me aside and said, "Hey, Gareth, by the way, there's this room full of documents that we found up in this secret mansion up in the mountains outside of Madrid that isn't officially part of the proper archive, but we just kind of brought it here, a chance to classify it yet. There might be some stuff in there that might be interesting for you." And lo and behold, there was an absolute mountain of stuff that is now, it's now pretty clear that they'd been kind of keeping this kind of secret archive completely separate from the official archives on purpose, because it revealed links between the bank to all kinds of nefarious operations linked to Opus Dei around the world, including these schools in Argentina that are now embroiled. They're now the center of this human trafficking case. So Opus Dei has been formally accused of engaging in human trafficking, the trafficking of young girls from Argentina to around the world, and basically kind of enslaving them. And yeah, this secret archive confirmed the links between this Spanish bank and these schools in Argentina.
Gareth, for listeners who might not be aware, and I would count myself amongst them, I think up until I read this book, my touch point for Opus Dei was the Da Vinci Code. And if I'm being honest, it was probably actually the Mad Magazine parody of the Da Vinci Code. What is Opus Dei?
You're not alone in, when I think the vast majority of people around the world, when they think Opus Dei, they think Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown and the Tom Hanks film. I probably would count myself in that category until relatively recently as well. But okay, so Opus Dei is an official part of the Catholic Church. It's an organization that has about 100,000 members around the world, about 20,000 of which are these kind of elite celibate members who dedicate their entire lives to the movement, who take these pledges of of celibacy, poverty, and obedience to Opus Dei. So they kind of basically agree to do whatever Opus Dei requires of them. It operates in about 70 countries around the world. It has a huge network of schools, about 300 schools, including a couple in Sydney. And it operates about 20 universities as well around the world. So officially what it does is, it's basically a kind of Catholicism, I guess. It builds itself as an organization that simply wants to help ordinary Catholics to live out their faith a little bit more seriously. So it's for your kind of like, effectively for your more serious Catholics. And what it professes to do is like, basically give them guidance, spiritual guidance, gives them the timetable of prayer that they're meant to kind of stick to, and kind of gives them an idea of how they should lead their lives. That's the official version. The unofficial version is that Opus Dei is an abusive and manipulative cult which controls and manipulates its members and basically uses its vast membership around the world to push a deeply reactionary and quite radical agenda. I mean, it's one quite telling fact is that unlike the rest of the Catholic Church, where you can basically kind of, anyone is welcome to join, Opus Dei is by invitation only. You can't go onto the Opus Dei website and punch in your details and say, hey guys, this all sounds great. I'm kind of interested in joining, send me a brochure in the post. That's not the way it works. Opus Dei finds you. And generally it targets the powerful and the wealthy elite. In particular, it goes after people in the world of business, in the world of politics, in the world of in the judiciary. And, that's for a very specific reason. The founder of Opus Dei, this Spanish priest called José María Escrivá, he realized right from the beginning that the way that you push forward your reactionary agenda, the way that you fight back against any progressive advances is by infiltrating the people in power. And that's been the hallmark of Opus Dei since it started up in the late 1920s. And that's the way it looks today.
Gareth, speaking of radical reactionaries, Escrivá had good relations, as does, I guess, or did Opus Dei, with the Franco regime. Can you talk a little about how Francoism shaped Opus Dei and what the role of Opus Dei was within Spain over the, 50 years that Franco reigned?
No, absolutely. I mean, and this kind of illustrates quite well the contradiction at the heart of Opus Dei. So this is an organization that likes to tell the world that it's simply a Catholic movement, a Christian movement that's guided by the teachings of Christ. It just wants to help ordinary Catholics to kind of be better Catholics, to kind of live out their faith more seriously. But, this is also an organization that had absolutely no qualms about cozying up to this brutal murderous dictatorship. Now, Franco, at the time that Opus Dei was cozying up to Franco in the late 1930s and 40s, and Opus Dei benefited enormously, both financially and practically. The Franco regime gave it huge amounts of support. So at the time that Opus Dei was cozying up to the regime, it had hundreds of thousands of people kind of working in labor camps, the Franco regime, this is. It was, rounding up leftist sympathizers and sending some of them off to be experimented on by the Nazis, because the Nazis were looking for the red gene, they called it. Franco was sending off these people. Opus Dei, deeply unchristian acts, but Opus Dei had absolutely no qualms at all about cozying up to it. And it wasn't a one-off. It's, Opus Dei would like to argue that, well, like the church, perhaps with the Nazis, those were just the times and we just had to face facts. And if we wanted to, move forward as a Catholic organization in Spain at the time, we had no option but to cozy up to the regime. But if you look, at its dealings with similarly brutal regimes elsewhere in the world, in places like Argentina, Chile, the Philippines, and other places, there's a pattern. It's no accident that Opus Dei has cozied up and indeed has flourished under these kinds of regimes. So yeah, I think it kind of confirms to me that the driving force is not Christian beliefs, but this radical reactionary agenda, and they don't care who they have to get into bed with to push that agenda forward.
Opus Dei has been successful on a number of different levels, including the sanctification of its founder about 20-something years ago. What's been the history of relations between Opus Dei and the church as a whole, and what's the nature of that relationship in 2025?
So in the early years, in the first kind of almost 50 years of Opus Dei's life, the organization had a very difficult relationship with the church. A number of popes, including John the 23rd, and they were deeply suspicious about Opus Dei. There were all kinds of concerns about the way it recruited people, about the way it abused things like confession and spiritual guidance sessions to control and manipulate, gather information about its membership. So yeah, I mean, the Vatican was very suspicious. At one stage, they were even worried about Opus Dei using its position inside of the Vatican to gather information against the Pope and the wider Holy See. So there was deep suspicion. But the election of John Paul II in 1978 changed everything. So Opus Dei had been effectively grooming this Polish archbishop for a number of years. Every time he came to Rome to visit, he was something of an outsider. And, they basically became extremely close to him. They promoted his writings. They published books and invited him to conferences. They really fostered quite a close relationship. So when he became Pope in 78, it was quite natural that he turned to Opus Dei as a kind of support base. So Opus Dei offered Pope John Paul II a number of benefits. Opus Dei already by then in the late 70s was operating globally. So they almost kind of proposed to John Paul II that they could be his kind of like private army all around the world, a way to bypass the normal hierarchy of the church, which might not be loyal to the Pope. Now, the Pope had a pretty conservative agenda, and many of the archbishops and cardinals around the world were quite left-leaning. And so for him, Opus Dei was a way, these were reliable allies that, were posted in Tokyo and Buenos Aires, across Africa, Australia, who could bypass and kind of report from those local dioceses and kind of bypassing the normal hierarchy of the church. And so seeing the potential of Opus Dei to kind of as a support network, he decided to give them these special powers and privileges. He elevated them to the status of what they call in the church the personal prelature. So Opus Dei was the very first personal prelature, and to this date is the only personal prelature to ever come into existence. And what this did was basically solidify Opus Dei's ability to operate outside of the normal hierarchy of the church. So becoming a personal prelature meant that they no longer had to answer to the local archbishop or whatever they were doing. The only person they had to answer to was the Pope. And so effectively the Pope kind of solidified this Opus Dei status as this kind of outside of the normal hierarchy, and allowed, many of the abuses and transgressions that have occurred over the years have allowed to kind of just carry on, because local archbishops, whenever they've seen these abuses or whatever, they've been powerless to step in and act. And so John Paul II, in addition to legitimizing Opus Dei, have, basically allowed it to continue abusing and manipulating people for many, many years to this day. But I mean, you're asking about relations today. I mean, things have begun to change. Benedict was already suspicious about Opus Dei, but he felt perhaps unable to act. But in recent years, Pope Francis has really started to tighten the screws. He is well aware of abuses that are taking place, spiritual abuses, psychological abuses, even physical abuse. He's aware of this. He's very much aware of this human trafficking case in Argentina. Of course, the Pope comes from Argentina. And so he's begun to chip away at Opus Dei's power and privileges. But at the same time, I think the Pope recognizes that Opus Dei has an extremely wealthy and powerful membership and support base. And so I think, it's quite telling that the Pope has only been able or felt able to chip away very slowly at Opus Dei's power. I think that's quite telling about, just how influential this organization still is within the Catholic Church. The Pope himself doesn't feel able to kind of fully go after them.
Gareth, the subtitle of the book references dark money. Obviously, this is how you got onto the story. What was the Banco Popular, and how did Opus Dei take it over?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of that's an incredible story in itself. I mean, one of the bosses of the bank was a devout Catholic. And he began turning to Opus Dei to basically to go confess and to offer him a bit of extra spiritual direction. And one day he told his Opus Dei kind of minders, for want of a better word, that he was really concerned about some business that was going on at the bank, that the chairman of the bank had done all of these dodgy deals in Paris that he knew the Franco regime was going to be really angry about. And so he was kind of in this kind of moral quandary. And so he was sharing this with his Opus Dei spiritual guidance council, who was supposed to be, helping him through this moral quandary. Instead, the Opus Dei Numeri took this information and relayed it back to Opus Dei, who then used this information to hijack the bank. They had this bit of compromat on the chairman of the bank, and they used it to muscle their way in. And it took them a number of years to do this, but they effectively kind of staged a takeover using this information to blackmail the chairman of the bank. And from then on, they, once they were inside, they rewired the bank and transformed it into this cash machine. They over the course of about 60, 70 years, they siphoned at least hundreds of millions of dollars, probably more like billions of dollars from the bank, and used it to finance the network that they now have all around the world. And so, I believe that without the bank, Opus Dei would not look the way that it does today. The money from the bank was used to create this vast network of schools. The schools in Sydney were financed using money from this Spanish bank. Tens of thousands of miles away from Spain, the local Opus Dei network in Australia was financed using money from this Spanish high street bank. And that is the case, all over the world. I traveled all over to the bank, and almost everywhere I went, you can pick any kind of country or continent, and you're almost guaranteed that the, money from this bank in Spain was used to set up the local Opus Dei network. And the schools are critical to this. And maybe we can get onto this. Opus Dei targets the elite. So it very much goes after politicians and judges and business people. And it kind of does that through, in part by approaching them directly and targeting them, grooming them. But also it sets up these kind of privileged schools, these very expensive schools for local Catholic communities. They don't advertise the fact that they are Opus Dei usually, but, the local kind of wealthy Catholic elites send their kids there. And it's, the kids are groomed and targeted, but also it's a way of kind of targeting the wider community. It's, the Opus Dei schools themselves are very much part of the recruitment network, recruiting the parents and they're recruiting the kids as well. Opus Dei says that no one can join until they're 18, but the kids are targeted from, the age of 12, 13. They're invited to these, the Opus Dei identifies potential recruits. It grooms them, targets them, it invites them to these kind of after school clubs. There was some great reporting recently in Australia where I think there was a great documentary on the ABC, but there was also some reporting, I think, in one of the newspapers. I think it might have been the Sydney Morning Herald, but it was where one of the kids that went to one of these schools was talking about how he'd been invited to this special kind of homework club after school, which was run by these Opus Dei celibate members. It's kind of, so it's kind of separate from the school, but obviously they'd been picked at the school and invited to it. And these were clearly kids that, that Opus Dei saw as potential recruits. The kids and their parents were completely unaware of what was going on. And one day at this supposed homework club, one of the kids, I think he was like 12, 13 years old, found this list, I think kind of hidden away in a drawer or whatever, with all the names of the kids on the list. And next to their names had been written the potential advantages that each of these potential benefits that each of these kids might offer to Opus Dei. There seemingly was no discussion about whether it was good for the kids themselves to be members of Opus Dei. It was all about what the kids might offer. And who knows, maybe they might have had powerful parents, or maybe, they had a way with other kids and might help to recruit more kids into the movement. But yeah, there's this crazy recruitment strategies kind of playing out in the schools and, used against kids and their parents unknowingly.
This is an organization that needs to stop leaving paperwork lying around.
Oh, it's incredible. But do you know what? I think the number of times, so I spoke to probably about 100 current members, as well as, a similar number of people who'd left the organization. I think it is a cult, and I don't use that word lightly. The way that it controls and abuses people, I think is, it ticks so many of the typical cult boxes, and the reverence, of course, around the founder of the movement. But I think a lot of these people are so brainwashed and are so kind of just deep into the narrative that's been pushed to them throughout their lives that they sometimes are completely unaware of that some of the stuff they're doing is, verging on criminality or just, deeply immoral. And, the number of times in the 5 years I spent reporting the book, that I would be interviewing someone from Opus Dei, or I would be reading a book written by someone from Opus Dei, and you would find, they'd share like incredible information with you, and you're kind of sat there scratching your head thinking to yourself, you shouldn't be telling me that. That makes you sound awful. But I think there's a complete lack of awareness because they're so deeply, so kind of mentally, psychologically, so deeply embedded in the organization that they don't question things. And so, they quite willingly, in some cases, share things which you think, oh my God, that's terrible. And, of course, me as a journalist, I'm writing this down thinking, well, this is definitely going in the book because it's an example of craziness. But yeah, I think there is you're right. I mean, there's a huge paper trail and of all this stuff, which is just incredible. And just to come back to what we were, the thing I mentioned earlier as well about this case in Argentina. So yeah, federal prosecutors in Argentina have conducted a 2-year-long investigation and have concluded that Opus Dei were engaging in human trafficking and serious kind of labor abuses, effectively recruiting girls as young as 12, 13 into lives of servitude who were forced to work 14-hour days for no money. And again, there's a paper trail that they followed. And again, you're left scratching your head. I mean, that's going to be playing out in the court in Argentina over the coming months. For Opus Dei priests are set to stand trial. But yeah, I mean, I know from my reporting, and again, coming back to the paper trail, what was happening in Argentina wasn't a one-off. There was an entire network of these schools that were recruiting these girls. There were schools in the Philippines, in Kenya, Nigeria, across Latin America, in Europe as well, in places like Belgium and France. There's an entire network. I think we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this horrendous story. And I think as investigators and prosecutors around the world begin to investigate further, they are likely to uncover a global network of human trafficking and abuse. I think this could well be the next huge scandal to hit the church.
That doesn't sound like something that anyone in public would like to be associated with. That is human trafficking. But do members of Opus Dei openly proclaim their membership? And how, I guess, successful has the organisation been in recruiting from among elites?
So, no, membership of Opus Dei is private, secret, some might say. And the only way of finding out whether someone is a member of Opus Dei, I mean, of course, Opus Dei has a list of members, but it doesn't share that with the world. And the only way of finding out whether someone is a member of Opus Dei or not is by asking them. And it's up to them whether or not they want to share that with you. But it has very successfully infiltrated, some of the big kind of power centers around the world. I mean, take the US, for example. There are only 3,000 Opus Dei members across the entire US, but 800 of them are concentrated in Washington, D.C. As a Catholic organization, you would have expected most of, the membership to be, I guess, focused in traditionally Catholic cities like Boston, Chicago, New York, perhaps, or I guess Miami these days because of the large Hispanic population. But no, Washington, D.C. is where, the greatest number of Opus Dei members live. And that is no accident. That's because Opus Dei has decided to pour resources into that city as a way, it's the most powerful city on earth. And so that's where it's poured its resources, and that's where it's really focused its recruitment efforts. And, the number, in researching the book, the number of people that are either members of Opus Dei or affiliates of Opus Dei, it's just staggering and incredible. And the names you come across of people who are either direct members or close to Opus Dei. You know, people like, the former Attorney General Bill Barr and Leonard Leo, the guy that's, basically single-handedly orchestrated this conservative takeover of the US Supreme Court. Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation and basically the architect of Project 2025. He's a regular at the Opus Dei Center in Central Washington. He gave a speech at some point about 18 months ago where he was kind of basically extolling the virtues of the Opus Dei founder and talking about how he had inspired him. But, even in Australia, the former Premier of New South Wales, Dominic Perrottet, he grew up in an Opus Dei family. And I believe he's even been on record talking about how he's a supernumerary member of Opus Dei. Again, it's no accident that Opus Dei targets these kinds of people because if you want to change the world, if you want to rip up any kind of progressive policy advances or you want to shape society, the way you do that is by recruiting the powerful and the wealthy. And that's precisely what it does everywhere that it operates around the world, including Australia.
Gareth, just finally, you mentioned Kevin Roberts and Project 2025. What sort of fingerprints of Opus Dei can you see when you look at the Project 2025 plan?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are a number of authors involved in Project 2025 that are either members of Opus Dei or closely affiliated to Opus Dei, including Kevin Roberts, who's obviously the president of the entire thing. For me, it's, obviously there are things that you'd expect, like the anti-abortion and this kind of stuff. But I think one of the striking things for me as well is there's a clear desire to set up this kind of voucher system in the US for schools. And basically that's a backdoor way of funding private schools, of funneling public money to private religious schools. And it's no coincidence that Opus Dei right now has a project to massively expand its network of schools in the US in order to continue recruiting kids and in order to continue recruiting the powerful elite right across the US. And there's certainly a lot of kind of crossover in terms of the ambitions that they have. Obviously, in things like rolling back any kinds of LGBTQ rights. I think, there's very much a huge crossover in the agenda. But I have to say as well that there's a lot of people will be thinking this is some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. And I need to be clear as well that what I'm saying in the book and what I'm saying now is I'm not implying that the head of Opus Dei in Rome is sat there issuing orders to the likes of Kevin Roberts and to Dominic Perrottet or whatever. That's just not the way it works. The best way of thinking about Opus Dei is as a network of like-minded individuals. And many of the people in that network will be officially Opus Dei members, but many people in the network won't be officially Opus Dei members. They're just kind of, I guess, fellow people who share this kind of reactionary radical agenda. And the job of Opus Dei is to create and foster that network and to make connections between people in the network to help kind of push the agenda forward. And so I think that's the best way of thinking about this. And somewhere like Spain, and this network kind of operates at different levels. In somewhere like Spain, which is Opus Dei's biggest country, about half of the Opus Dei membership comes from Spain. Opus Dei has very successfully infiltrated almost every element of society there. The Opus Dei network of members and of affiliates just expands across every line of business and culture and whatever. It's incredible. And I think that's the aim of Opus Dei in other countries, to create a network that spans business and politics and education, both schools and kind of universities, so that they can kind of push forward this agenda and not just change laws, but also change the culture and to change society. That's the kind of bottom line here, that they see themselves as crusaders who are literally, in the words of the founder, carrying out the orders of Christ. This is a religious war for them, and they will stop at nothing to be victors.
Well, you know what Jesus said? The extremely rich will inherit the earth, so they're doing a good job.
They're doing an extremely good job, that's true. At least in their eyes.
Gareth, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. If people want to read the book, it is called Opus, and they can find you on Blue Sky at Gareth Gore. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you guys for having me. It's been a pleasure to be on the show.
Well, Andy, that is our program. Just a reminder to listeners, it is subscriber month here on 3CR. If you wanted to support the station, you can do so by going to 3cr.org.au/subscribe or calling during business hours 9419 8377. We really appreciate it. All right, and we'll see you next week.
We will. See you then.
At the ceiling from below, splendid Michelangelo, fill my heart with delight. That's Saturday night. I ride believing from home, find every step inside St. Peter's Dome, claustrophobic and ex-Catholic. Last Saturday night. Now how come nobody really noticed? Puff of white smoke knocked me out. Truth is hiding, lurking, banking. Things I do at night. It's quite suspicious, to say the least.
Every year, Wildlife Victoria receives tens of thousands of calls reporting sick, injured or orphaned wildlife. The biggest reason? Road accidents. If you're driving and hit a native animal or see an animal injured by the side of the road, call Wildlife Victoria's Emergency Response Service on 03 84 00 7300. And remember to slow down, especially between dusk and dawn. Wildlife Victoria is a 3CR supporter.
Show your solidarity. Subscribe. Go to 3cr.org.au or call 9419 8377.